The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the dusty main street of Silver City, New Mexico, and Amelia Jensen's heart hammered so violently against her ribs that she thought it might break free entirely. 3 weeks of travel from Boston had brought her to this moment, to this sun-scorched town that looked nothing like the romantic descriptions in the letters she had received, and to a man she had never met but had promised to marry. Her hands trembled as she clutched her worn leather satchel, the only piece of luggage that had survived the rough journey intact, and she pressed them against her lap, trying to still their shaking. The year was 1882, and at 23 years old, she had left behind everything familiar to become a mail-order bride to a rancher named Thomas Xavier. The driver opened the door and offered his weathered hand. "Miss Jensen, we have arrived. Silver City, as promised." Amelia took a deep breath and accepted his assistance, stepping down onto the wooden platform. The September heat hit her immediately, so different from the crisp autumn air she had left behind in Massachusetts. Her dark blue traveling dress, sensible for the East Coast, felt suffocating in the desert climate. She looked around the street, taking in the wooden buildings with their false fronts, the horses tied to hitching posts, and the curious stares of locals who had paused their activities to observe the newcomer. "You waiting for Thomas Xavier?" the driver asked, hauling down her trunk from the top of the coach. "Yes, I am. Do you know him?" "Everyone knows Thomas. Good man, honest, works hard on that ranch of his." The driver scratched his gray beard. "Should be here any minute. He does not miss appointments." Amelia nodded, trying to draw comfort from the stranger's words. Her hands continued to shake, and she clasped them together in front of her, squeezing until her knuckles turned white. What if he took one look at her and changed his mind? What if she disappointed him? What if the letters they had exchanged over the past 6 months had painted false pictures of who they really were? "Amelia Jensen." The voice came from behind her, deep and steady with a slight roughness that suggested years of calling to cattle across open ranges. She turned slowly, and her breath caught in her throat. Thomas Xavier stood about 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that strained against his clean but worn shirt. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though at this moment he looked as nervous as she felt. His dark hair needed a trim, curling slightly at his collar, and his brown eyes studied her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. He held his hat in his hands, turning it in a slow rotation that betrayed his own anxiety. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Xavier, Thomas, please." He took a step closer, and she noticed he moved with a slight limp favoring his left leg. He had not mentioned any injury in his letters. "I apologize for not arriving sooner. One of the horses threw a shoe on the way into town, and I had to walk him the last mile." "That is quite all right. I only just arrived myself." Amelia tried to still her trembling hands, but they would not cooperate. The enormity of what she had done, traveling across the country to marry a stranger, suddenly overwhelmed her. Her vision blurred slightly, and she swayed on her feet. Thomas moved quickly, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. His hands, large and calloused, gently took both of hers, steadying her. The warmth of his touch traveled up her arms, and she looked up into his face, seeing genuine concern there. "I will steady you always," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know this is frightening. I know you have given up everything you knew to come here, but I promise you, Amelia, I will be the man you need. I will take care of you, protect you, and do everything in my power to make you happy. You will never have to face anything alone again." The sincerity in his voice broke through her panic. She saw in his eyes that he was just as scared as she was, just as uncertain about this leap of faith they were both taking. But she also saw determination and kindness, and something that looked like hope. "Thank you," she whispered, and for the first time since arriving, she felt her hands begin to calm in his steady grip. Thomas smiled then, and those lines around his eyes deepened. "You are even more beautiful than I imagined from your photograph, and that does not do you justice." Heat rose to her cheeks. "You are very kind. I am honest." He released one of her hands but kept hold of the other, and it felt natural, right? "Are you hungry? Thirsty? The journey must have been exhausting." "All of the above," she admitted with a small laugh. "Then let me get your trunk, and we will go to the hotel. I have taken a room for you there. I thought you would want some time to rest and refresh yourself before we talk about the wedding arrangements." He paused, looking uncertain again. "Unless you have changed your mind." "I would understand if you have. No obligations, Amelia. You are free to take the next stage back east if that is what you want." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the vulnerability beneath his strong exterior. He was giving her a way out, even though it probably cost him his pride to do so. That told her more about his character than all his letters combined. "I have not changed my mind," she said firmly, and watched relief flood his features. Thomas loaded her trunk onto a wagon he had parked nearby and helped her up onto the seat. As they drove the short distance to the hotel, he pointed out various buildings and businesses, narrating the town like a tour guide. "That is the Mercantile, where you can get most anything you need. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, is a kind woman, a bit nosy but means well. Over there is the saloon, which you should probably avoid, though it is not as rough as some. The church is at the end of the street. Reverend Matthews performs most of the weddings in town. He is a good man, fair-minded." "How long have you lived in Silver City?" Amelia asked, grateful for the distraction of conversation. "5 years now. I came out from Missouri after the war, saved my money working for other ranchers until I could buy my own land. It is not much yet, but it is growing. I have about 200 head of cattle now, good grazing land, and a house that is solid if not fancy." "You fought in the war." She had been only a child during those years, but the effects had rippled through every corner of the country. His jaw tightened. "I did. Got this leg injury at Wilson Creek, early in the fighting. Took a while to heal properly, but I can work just fine now. Does not slow me down much. I am sorry. That must have been terrible. It was a long time ago." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a 2-story building with a sign that read Silver City Hotel. "Here we are. Let me help you down." Thomas secured a room for her and carried her trunk upstairs himself, despite the hotel keeper's offer to send a boy to do it. He set it carefully at the foot of the bed and then stood awkwardly in the doorway, clearly unsure of the proper protocol. "I will let you rest," he said. "Would you like to have dinner with me this evening? There is a decent restaurant just down the street. We could talk more, get to know each other." "I would like that very much." "Good. I will come by at 6 if that suits you." "That would be perfect," he nodded, put his hat back on, and then paused. "Amelia, I am glad you are here, truly glad. I know this is all strange and new, but I think we can make a good life together." "I think so too, Thomas." After he left, Amelia sank onto the bed, finally allowing herself to process everything. She looked around the simple room with its plain furniture and single window overlooking the street. This was so far from the life she had known in Boston, where she had worked as a seamstress in a crowded shop, living in a boarding house with 6 other women, all of them struggling to make ends meet. When her closest friend had shown her the advertisement for mail-order brides, she had initially dismissed it as desperate. But the more she thought about it, the more appealing it became. What did she have in Boston? No family, no prospects for marriage among the limited men she knew, and a future that looked increasingly bleak. Thomas's letters had been thoughtful and genuine. He had not made grand promises or painted impossible pictures. He had been honest about the challenges of ranch life, the hard work required, the isolation. But he had also written about the beauty of the desert sunsets, the satisfaction of building something with his own hands, and his desire for a true partnership with someone who wanted to create a new life. That honesty had touched her heart. She unpacked her few belongings and washed the travel dust from her face and hands using the basin of water provided. Looking in the small mirror above the dresser, she barely recognized herself. Her brown hair had escaped its pins during the journey, and her face looked thinner than she remembered. But her green eyes, her best feature according to her mother years ago, still held determination. She could do this. She would do this. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at her door. Thomas stood in the hallway, cleaned up and wearing a jacket despite the lingering heat. He offered his arm, and they walked together to the restaurant. The meal was simple but good: beef stew with fresh bread and apple pie for dessert. They talked about inconsequential things at first: the weather, the journey, the town. But gradually, as they relaxed in each other's company, the conversation deepened. "Why did you decide to advertise for a wife?" Amelia asked, setting down her fork. "Surely there are women here in Silver City who would be interested in marrying you." Thomas smiled wryly. "Not as many as you might think. The ones who are unmarried are quite young, daughters of ranchers and merchants who have known me since they were children. It would feel strange courting them. And the women closer to my age are either already married or widowed with specific ideas about what they want in a husband, usually someone with more money than I currently have. You are 29, correct? That is what you wrote in your letters." "Yes. And you are 23. A good age, I think. Old enough to know your own mind, but young enough to adapt to a new life." "I had to know my own mind from a young age," Amelia said quietly. "My parents died when I was 15. Yellow fever took them within days of each other. I have been on my own since then, working, surviving." Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. "I am sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult. It taught me to be strong, to rely on myself." She looked at their joined hands. "But I am tired of being alone, Thomas. I want a family, a home, someone to share my life with. That is why I answered your advertisement." "I want those things too," he said seriously. "I have built a ranch, but it is just land and cattle without someone to share it with. I want children someday if God blesses us with them. I want a partner who will stand beside me through the hard times and celebrate the good times. I want to build something that lasts. Tell me about your ranch. Really tell me. What will my life be like there?" Thomas leaned back, considering his words. "It is about an hour's ride from town. The house is 1 story, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room. I built it myself over the course of 2 years. It has a good well for water, a barn for the horses, and a chicken coop, though the chickens are a bit temperamental. The land is beautiful, Amelia. Mountains in the distance, open range for the cattle, cottonwood trees along the creek that runs through the property. It is peaceful there. It sounds wonderful. But it is also hard work. I have 2 ranch hands who help with the cattle, brothers named Jack and Henry Morrison. They are good men, respectful. They have their own cabin on the far side of the property. But much of the work still falls to me, and I will not lie to you, ranch life is demanding. The cattle need constant attention, predators are always a threat, and the weather can be harsh. Winter can be brutally cold, summer mercilessly hot. I am not afraid of hard work," Amelia said firmly. "I have worked since I was 15 years old. I can cook, clean, sew, tend a garden. I learn quickly. I believe you." He squeezed her hand gently. "When would you like to have the wedding?" I thought perhaps you would want a few days to settle in, to be sure." "I am sure, Thomas. I did not travel all this way to turn back. If it is acceptable to you, I would like to marry soon, perhaps in 3 days. That would give me time to make myself a decent dress, and you time to make whatever arrangements are needed." His face lit up. 3 days would be perfect. I will speak with Reverend Matthews tomorrow morning." They finished their meal in comfortable conversation, and Thomas walked her back to the hotel. At the door to her room he hesitated, then bent and kissed her cheek gently. "Good night, Amelia. Sleep well." "Good night, Thomas." The next 3 days passed in a flurry of activity. Amelia visited the mercantile and purchased fabric for a wedding dress, cream-colored cotton with delicate embroidery. She worked late into the nights, her skilled seamstress fingers creating something beautiful from the simple material. Mrs. Patterson, the mercantile owner, took an immediate liking to her and spread the word about the upcoming wedding, generating excitement in the small town. Thomas visited her each day, taking her around Silver City, introducing her to townspeople, and telling her more about his life and his plans for the ranch. She learned that he was respected in the community, known for his honesty and fair dealing. Several women told her she was lucky to be marrying such a good man, and she found herself agreeing wholeheartedly. On the 3rd day, she stood in her hotel room wearing the cream dress she had made, her hair pinned up with a few loose curls framing her face. Mrs. Patterson had loaned her a beautiful lace veil that had belonged to her own mother, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Thomas had picked himself and delivered that morning. The wedding took place in the small church at the end of the main street. The pews were surprisingly full, townspeople having turned out to celebrate. The Morrison brothers were there, both in their 30s, weathered and kind-faced. Several merchant families attended, along with a surprising number of ranchers from the surrounding area who knew and respected Thomas. When Thomas turned to watch her walk down the aisle, the look on his face made her heart skip. He wore his best clothes, his hair neatly trimmed, and his expression held such wonder and hope that she felt tears prick her eyes. This good man had waited for her, had taken a chance on her just as she had taken a chance on him. Reverend Matthews performed a simple but lovely ceremony. When it came time for the vows, Thomas's voice rang clear and strong. "I, Thomas Elijah Xavier, take you, Amelia Marie Jensen, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. In sickness and in health, in poverty and in wealth, I will stand by your side. This I vow before God and these witnesses." Amelia's voice trembled slightly but did not break. "I, Amelia Marie Jensen, take you, Thomas Elijah Xavier, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, support you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. In sickness and in health, in poverty and in wealth, I will stand by your side. This I vow before God and these witnesses." The ring Thomas slipped on her finger was simple gold, perfectly sized and warm from his pocket. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her gently, reverently, and the church erupted in applause. The townspeople had organized a small reception in the church hall, with food contributed by various families. Amelia found herself overwhelmed by the kindness and welcome of these strangers who were now her community. Women offered advice about living on a ranch, men clapped Thomas on the back and congratulated him, and everyone seemed genuinely happy for them. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas leaned close and whispered, "Are you ready to see your new home?" "Yes," she said, realizing she truly was. They said their goodbyes and thank yous, and Thomas helped her into his wagon, now loaded with her trunk and several packages of gifts from the townspeople. As they drove away from Silver City, heading southwest toward his ranch, Amelia felt a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness. The landscape was unlike anything she had known in Boston. The open expanse of land stretched endlessly, dotted with scrub brush and cacti, with mountains rising in purple shadows against the horizon. The sky seemed impossibly large, a brilliant blue that hurt to look at directly. Thomas pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a bend in the road, teaching her to navigate this new terrain. "The land gets better once we cross the creek," he said. "More water means better grazing for the cattle. That is why I chose this particular property when it came up for sale." After about an hour, they crested a small rise, and Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop. "There," he said softly. "That is home." Amelia looked down into a shallow valley where a house sat surrounded by trees. It was not large, but it was solid and well built, with a wide porch across the front and a stone chimney rising from one end. A barn stood nearby, and she could see cattle dotting the landscape beyond. Smoke rose from the Morrison brothers' cabin in the distance. A creek glittered in the afternoon sun, and the whole scene had a peaceful, settled quality that immediately appealed to her. "It is beautiful," she breathed. Thomas looked at her, searching her face for signs of disappointment. "Really? You are not just saying that, really?" "It is exactly what I hoped for." His relief was palpable. He drove the wagon down to the house, where the Morrison brothers were waiting to greet them. Jack, the older one at 35, had a thick beard and a booming laugh. Henry, 32, was quieter but smiled warmly at Amelia. "Welcome, Mrs. Xavier," Jack said, sweeping off his hat. "We have done our best to get the house ready for you. Fresh water in the well, cleaned out the chicken coop, even convinced these ornery hens to lay some eggs." "Thank you both so much," Amelia said. "I appreciate your kindness." "We will take care of the wagon and give you two some privacy," Henry added. "Congratulations on your wedding." The brothers made themselves scarce, and Thomas carried Amelia's trunk inside. She stepped over the threshold of her new home and looked around with eager eyes. The interior was simple but clean, with wooden floors, whitewashed walls, and handmade furniture that showed Thomas's craftsmanship. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the sitting room, with a rug before it and two comfortable-looking chairs. The kitchen had a good stove, a sturdy table, and open shelves holding basic supplies. Through an open door, she could see the bedroom with its large bed covered in a colorful quilt. "I know it is not fancy," Thomas began, but Amelia cut him off. "It is perfect. It is a home, Thomas. A real home." He set down her trunk and came to stand before her, taking her hands in his just as he had done that first day at the stagecoach. "I have thought about this moment for months," he said quietly. "Imagined what it would be like to finally have you here. The reality is so much better than anything I dreamed." Amelia felt warmth spread through her chest. In the few days she had known him, Thomas had shown her nothing but kindness, respect, and genuine care. She was beginning to understand that what she felt for him went beyond gratitude or relief at finding security. She was falling in love with her husband. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "I was so frightened when I stepped off that stagecoach, but you steadied me, just as you promised. And you have continued to steady me every moment since." Thomas pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. She rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. "We are going to make a good life together, Amelia. I promise you that." That night, they ate a simple supper of bread, cheese, and the eggs the Morrison brothers had collected. Afterward, Thomas showed her around the property in the fading light, introducing her to the horses in the barn, 3 sturdy working animals and 1 pretty mare he said was now hers to ride. He pointed out where he planned to expand the barn next spring, where she could plant a vegetable garden and where the best fishing spots were along the creek. As darkness fell and they returned to the house, Amelia felt a contentment she had not known in years. When they retired to the bedroom, Thomas was gentle and patient, and she felt her love for him deepen even further. The following weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm as Amelia learned the patterns of ranch life. She rose early with Thomas, making breakfast while he tended to the most urgent morning chores. She learned to collect eggs from the temperamental chickens, a task that initially frustrated her but eventually made her laugh at their stubborn personalities. She started a vegetable garden in a sunny spot near the house, planting seeds for beans, squash, and tomatoes that Mrs. Patterson had given her as a wedding gift. Thomas taught her to ride the mare, a patient animal named Daisy, and they took long rides around the property together in the cooler evening hours. He showed her how to recognize different plants, which were useful and which were dangerous. He taught her to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of the animals. She found herself fascinated by this new knowledge, so different from anything she had learned in Boston. The Morrison brothers became regular fixtures at their dinner table, joining them several times a week for meals. Amelia enjoyed their company and their stories about the early days of the ranch. In return, she mended their clothes and made sure they had home-cooked food regularly, knowing they lived a rough bachelor existence in their cabin. One evening, about 6 weeks after the wedding, Thomas came in from a long day of moving cattle to new grazing land. He looked exhausted, covered in dust, and limping more noticeably than usual. Amelia helped him wash up and insisted he sit while she served dinner. "You worked too hard today," she said, concern in her voice. "Your leg is bothering you. It is nothing. Just an old injury acting up." But he winced as he sat down. After dinner, Amelia heated water and made him soak his leg, then massaged it with liniment. As she worked, Thomas looked down at her with such tenderness that it took her breath away. "I love you, Amelia," he said quietly. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, all courage and fear mixed together. But now, living with you, seeing how you have embraced this life, how you care for me and make this house a home, I love you more than I thought possible." Amelia looked up at him, her hand stilling on his leg. "I love you too, Thomas. I was so worried when I came here that it would be a marriage of convenience only. But you have shown me what real partnership means, what real love looks like. I have never been happier than I am right now." He pulled her up and kissed her deeply, and that night they reaffirmed their love for each other with a passion that had been building since their wedding day. As autumn turned to winter, Amelia discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but wanted to be certain before she told Thomas. When she finally shared the news one evening in early December, sitting by the fire as snow fell softly outside, Thomas's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He let out a whoop of joy that probably carried all the way to the Morrison brothers' cabin, then gathered her in his arms and spun her around despite her laughing protests. "A baby! We are going to have a baby." "Yes, we are. Sometime in early summer, I think." He set her down carefully as if she were suddenly made of glass. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need anything? Should you be doing less work?" She laughed at his sudden worry. "I am fine, Thomas. Women have babies all the time. I am healthy and strong." But from that moment on, he treated her like precious china, insisting she rest more, refusing to let her lift anything heavy, and hovering whenever she did any task he deemed potentially dangerous. It was simultaneously endearing and frustrating. The winter passed slowly but peacefully. Amelia spent much of her time indoors, sewing clothes for the baby and preparing the smallest bedroom as a nursery. Thomas brought in wood he had carved into the beginnings of a cradle, and together they sanded and finished it until it was smooth and beautiful. The Morrison brothers contributed a colorful baby blanket that Henry's mother had made years ago, which he had been saving for just such an occasion. In January, a severe snowstorm hit the region, dumping nearly 2 feet of snow and bringing temperatures so low that water froze in the buckets overnight. Thomas and the Morrison brothers worked tirelessly to protect the cattle, building windbreaks and making sure the animals had access to unfrozen water. Amelia kept fires burning in both the house and the bunkhouse, prepared hot meals, and worried constantly whenever Thomas was outside in the brutal cold. One night, when the storm was at its worst, Thomas struggled back to the house well after dark, ice clinging to his coat and eyebrows. Amelia had been watching anxiously out the window for hours, and she rushed to help him inside. "We lost 2 calves," he said, his voice heavy with grief. "Could not get to them in time. They froze before we could bring them to shelter." She helped him remove his frozen outer clothes and brought him hot coffee. "You did everything you could. It is not enough. Those calves represented money we need, especially now with a baby coming. Thomas, look at me." She waited until he met her eyes. "We will be fine. We have enough. And we have each other. That is what matters most." He pulled her close, careful of her expanding belly. "How did I get so lucky to find you? I think we found each other," she said softly. "The storm passed and the ranch survived." When spring finally arrived, bringing green grass and warmer temperatures, the whole land seemed to come alive. The cattle that had survived the winter looked healthy, and several cows gave birth to new calves that frolicked in the fields. Amelia's garden began to sprout, and she spent happy hours tending the growing plants. Her pregnancy progressed normally, though she grew increasingly uncomfortable as summer approached. Thomas fretted constantly, and when she was 2 weeks from her due date, he insisted they move into town so she would be close to the doctor. They took a room at the hotel, and Thomas remained by her side, only returning to the ranch when absolutely necessary and always hurrying back as quickly as possible. On a hot June afternoon, Amelia's labor began. The doctor, an older man named Dr. Harrison, who had delivered half the children in Silver City, came immediately. Thomas paced the hotel hallway, wearing a path in the wooden floor, while Mrs. Patterson stayed with Amelia to assist. The labor was long and difficult. Evening turned to night, and night began to fade toward dawn. Thomas finally could not bear being separated from her any longer and pushed his way into the room despite Dr. Harrison's protests. "I am not leaving her," he said firmly. "She is my wife and she needs me." Amelia, exhausted and in pain, reached for his hand. "Stay," she whispered. "Please stay." And so Thomas remained, holding her hand, wiping her brow and murmuring encouragements as she struggled to bring their child into the world. Finally, as the sun rose on a new day, a baby's cry filled the room. "It is a boy," Dr. Harrison announced. "A healthy, strong boy." Thomas looked at his son with wonder, tears streaming down his face. The baby, red-faced and squalling, had a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. When Dr. Harrison placed the cleaned and wrapped infant in Amelia's arms, she looked down at him with overwhelming love. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." "What shall we name him?" Thomas asked, unable to take his eyes off his son. "What about Matthew?" "Matthew Thomas Xavier," Amelia suggested. "Matthew," Thomas repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Matthew Thomas Xavier. Welcome to the world, son." They stayed in town for another week so Dr. Harrison could monitor Amelia's recovery. True to his word, Thomas steadied her through the difficult days after birth, taking care of her and the baby with tireless devotion. When they finally returned to the ranch, carrying their precious son, it felt like coming home in a deeper way than ever before. The ranch hands were delighted with the new arrival. Jack carved wooden toys, and Henry fashioned a mobile to hang above the cradle, with horses and stars that turned gently in any breeze. The house filled with the sounds of a baby, crying and cooing and eventually laughing, and Amelia thought she had never heard more beautiful music. Matthew proved to be a good baby, healthy and curious about everything around him. As the months passed and he grew, Amelia and Thomas settled into the rhythms of parenthood while maintaining the ranch. It was exhausting but deeply fulfilling. One evening, when Matthew was about 6 months old and sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Amelia and Thomas sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thomas had his arm around her, and she leaned into his solid warmth. "You ever think about Boston?" he asked. "Do you ever regret coming here?" "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "My real life began the day I stepped off that stagecoach and you steadied my trembling hands. Everything before that was just waiting for this." "I think about that day often," Thomas admitted. "I was terrified you would take one look at me at this rough land and want to leave. But you were so brave, even though I could see how scared you were. We were both scared, but we faced it together, and look what we have built." She gestured at the ranch spread before them, at the house behind them where their son slept. "A home, a family, a life. It is more than I ever dreamed possible." Thomas pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head. "I will steady you always, Amelia, through whatever comes. That is my promise to you. And I will stand beside you always," she replied. "Through whatever comes. That is my promise to you." The years that followed were good ones. The ranch continued to grow as Thomas proved his skills as a rancher and businessman. He bought more land, increased his herd, and built a reputation for raising quality cattle. Amelia managed the household, raised their children, and became known in Silver City for her sewing skills, taking on projects for other families and saving the money for their future. When Matthew was 3 years old, Amelia gave birth to twin girls they named Sarah and Rebecca. The double blessing delighted everyone, though it made life significantly busier. Thomas built an addition onto the house, adding 2 more bedrooms to accommodate their growing family. The Morrison brothers remained loyal employees and beloved honorary uncles to the children, though Henry eventually married a widow from town and moved into Silver City, continuing to work at the ranch but commuting each day. Matthew grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy who followed his father everywhere, already learning the ways of ranch life. The twins, as they grew from babies to toddlers, showed distinct personalities. Sarah was quiet and thoughtful, often found examining plants and insects with intense concentration. Rebecca was bold and loud, climbing anything she could reach and keeping Amelia constantly alert. Through it all, Amelia and Thomas's love deepened and matured. They faced challenges together: bad years when cattle prices dropped, droughts that tested their resources, and the normal struggles of raising children. But they also celebrated triumphs, good years when everything went right, watching their children grow healthy and happy, and the simple joy of ending each day together. One particular winter, when Matthew was 7 and the twins were 4, a severe influenza outbreak hit Silver City. Many families fell ill and several people died. The Xavier family isolated themselves at the ranch, avoiding town, but the sickness eventually found them anyway. First the twins fell ill, then Matthew, and finally Thomas. Amelia, somehow remaining healthy, threw herself into nursing her family with desperate determination. She made endless pots of soup, brewed medicinal teas, kept the fire burning hot to ward off chills, and prayed harder than she ever had in her life. The children recovered relatively quickly, their young bodies fighting off the illness within a week. But Thomas's case was severe. His fever climbed dangerously high, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. Amelia sat by his bed day and night, bathing his burning skin with cool water, forcing liquids down his throat, and begging him to hold on. On the worst night, when his fever peaked and he barely seemed to breathe, Amelia clutched his hand and whispered fiercely, "You promised to steady me always, Thomas Xavier. You cannot leave me now, you cannot. I need you. Our children need you. Fight this. Please fight this." Whether he heard her in his delirium or simply reached the crisis point of the illness, Thomas's fever finally broke just before dawn. He opened his eyes, truly conscious for the first time in days, and looked at her with recognition. "Amelia," he rasped. "I am here," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I am right here, and you are going to be fine." "You steadied me," he said weakly. "This time you steadied me." She laughed through her tears. "We steady each other. That is how this works." Thomas's recovery was slow, but he gradually regained his strength. By early spring, he was back to full activities on the ranch, and life returned to normal. But the scare had reminded them both how precious and fragile their happiness was, and they held each other a little tighter after that. When Matthew turned 10, Thomas began seriously teaching him ranch work. Not just the simple chores he had been doing, but real skills like roping cattle, mending fences, and reading the land. Matthew took to it naturally, showing an aptitude that filled Thomas with pride. The boy also showed his mother's kindness, often found helping his younger sisters or bringing injured animals home to heal. The twins at 7 were inseparable, despite their different temperaments. Sarah had developed a love of books and learning, and Amelia spent hours teaching her to read and write. Rebecca showed a talent with horses that impressed even the experienced ranch hands, riding fearlessly and communicating with the animals in an almost uncanny way. Amelia looked at her children and marveled at the life she and Thomas had created. These 3 beautiful, healthy, happy children who would never know the loneliness and struggle she had endured in Boston. They were growing up surrounded by love, with parents who adored them and each other, with land and animals and freedom. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Amelia with a trip to Santa Fe, their first real journey away from the ranch since Matthew's birth. They left the children in the capable care of Jack Morrison and his wife, who had moved into the main house for the week, and set off on an adventure. Santa Fe enchanted Amelia with its mix of cultures, its beautiful architecture, and its thriving market where she bought gifts for the children and supplies for the ranch. But more than the sights, she treasured the uninterrupted time with Thomas. They stayed in a fine hotel, ate in restaurants, and talked late into the night like they had in those early days of their marriage. "Would you change anything?" Thomas asked one evening as they walked through the plaza in the warm twilight. "If you could go back, knowing everything that would happen, would you still get on that stage coach?" "In a heartbeat," Amelia said without hesitation. "Would you still advertise for a mail-order bride?" "Absolutely. Though I would specify that she needed to be you specifically." He smiled and pulled her close. "These have been the happiest 10 years of my life, Amelia. You made me believe in love, in family, in the possibility of real joy." "You saved me," she said simply. "I was so alone, so lost, and you gave me everything I ever wanted. A home, a family, purpose, and love. So much love." They renewed their vows quietly in a small chapel in Santa Fe, just the two of them and the priest, reaffirming the promises they had made 10 years earlier in Silver City. This time there was no trembling, no fear, only certainty and deep, abiding love. When they returned to the ranch, the children mobbed them with hugs and excited stories about everything that had happened while they were gone. Life resumed its comfortable patterns, but both Amelia and Thomas carried with them the renewed sense of gratitude for what they had built together. 2 years later, when Amelia was 35 and starting to think their family was complete, she discovered she was pregnant again. The surprise baby, another boy they named Daniel, arrived just before Christmas, a gift that delighted the whole family. Matthew, now 12, took his role as big brother seriously, while the 9-year-old twins fought over who got to hold him first. Daniel proved to be a calm, peaceful baby who rarely cried and seemed content to observe the busy household around him. Thomas, now 41, joked that his knees were too old to chase another toddler, but Amelia saw how he cradled his youngest son with the same wonder he had shown with Matthew. The years continued to pass. Matthew grew into a strong young man, deciding at 16 that he wanted to be a rancher like his father. Thomas made him a full partner in the operation, and together they expanded the ranch even further. Sarah, at 13, became the most educated person for miles around, reading every book she could get her hands on and expressing a desire to become a teacher. Rebecca, equally 13, practically lived on horseback and showed such skill that neighboring ranchers began asking her to help train their difficult horses. Daniel grew into a curious, gentle boy who loved animals and showed a particular affinity for healing them. Whenever a ranch animal was sick or injured, Daniel would sit with it for hours, somehow soothing it with his presence. Amelia and Thomas, now in their 40s, watched their children grow with pride and occasional amazement that these remarkable people had come from them. The ranch had become one of the most successful in the region, but more importantly, their home had become known as a place of warmth and welcome. Jack Morrison retired at 60, moving into a small house in Silver City that Thomas helped him buy, a thank you for decades of loyal service. New ranch hands came and went, but the ranch continued to thrive under Thomas and Matthew's management. One late summer evening, when Amelia was 43 and Thomas was 49, they took one of their regular evening rides around the property. The cattle grazed peacefully, the crops in the expanded fields looked healthy, and in the distance, they could see Matthew working with a horse in the corral while Rebecca watched and offered advice. Through the window of the house, they could see Sarah helping Daniel with his arithmetic homework. "Look at all of this," Thomas said, gesturing broadly at the land and the life they had created. "Do you remember that scared young woman who stepped off the stagecoach with trembling hands?" "Barely," Amelia admitted. "It feels like a lifetime ago, like that was a different person." In many ways it was. We have both changed so much, grown so much. "But some things have never changed," Amelia said, reaching for his hand. "You still steady me every single day when I am worried about the children or the ranch or the future. You are my constant, my rock." "And you are my heart," Thomas replied. "Everything good in my life traces back to you. Every joy, every triumph, every moment of happiness. It all started when you said yes, when you took a chance on a rough cowboy with more dreams than money." "Best decision I ever made," she said with a smile. They rode back to the house as the sun set, painting the desert sky in brilliant colors. As they dismounted and Thomas helped her down from her horse, just as he had done countless times before, Amelia felt a profound sense of completion. This was the life they had built together, starting from nothing but hope and courage. Through challenges and triumphs, through fears and joys, through ordinary days and extraordinary moments, they had created something beautiful and lasting. That night, gathered around the dinner table with all four of their children, sharing a meal and laughter and stories about the day, Amelia caught Thomas's eye across the table. He smiled at her, that same smile that had eased her fears on their wedding day, and she smiled back. This was the happy ending she had dreamed of, but never quite believed possible. This was the forever she had hoped for when she answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride and traveled across the country to marry a stranger. Thomas had promised to steady her always, and he had kept that promise every day of their marriage. But more than that, they had learned to steady each other, to be partners in every sense of the word, to build a love that grew stronger with each passing year. As the evening wound down and the children headed to bed, Amelia and Thomas stood on their porch watching the stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. Thomas wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. "I love you, Amelia Xavier," he murmured into her hair. "I love you, Thomas Xavier," she replied. They stood there for a long time, two people who had started as strangers, become partners, and forged a love that would last the rest of their lives. The trembling hands that had once clutched a satchel in fear now rested confidently in his steady grip, and both of them knew that whatever the future brought, they would face it together, just as they always had. The years continued to unfold with the changing seasons. Matthew married at 22 to a sweet young woman named Catherine from a neighboring ranch. Their wedding was a joyous affair that brought together families from across the region, and within a year, Amelia and Thomas found themselves grandparents to a baby girl named Emma. Amelia held her granddaughter for the first time with tears in her eyes, marveling at the continuation of the family she and Thomas had created. Thomas, now a grandfather at 51, grumbled good-naturedly about being old but couldn't hide his delight as he gently rocked the baby. Sarah fulfilled her dream of becoming a teacher, taking over the small schoolhouse in Silver City when she was 19. She had a gift for reaching children others deemed difficult, and she became beloved in the community. At 21, she married the new doctor in town, a kind young man named Joseph who had come west from Philadelphia and shared her love of learning. Rebecca, true to her nature, waited until she was 23 to marry, choosing a horse trainer from Texas who matched her independence and skill with animals. Together, they started a business breeding and training horses on a portion of land Thomas gifted them adjacent to the main ranch. Their operation became known throughout the territory for producing exceptional animals. Daniel, the youngest, showed no interest in settling down young. At 18, he announced his intention to study veterinary medicine, a relatively new field but one perfectly suited to his gifts. Thomas and Amelia supported his decision, and he left for school in Denver, promising to return and serve the ranching community of New Mexico. Through all these changes and milestones, the ranch remained the center of the family. Thomas eventually turned over most of the daily operations to Matthew, though he still rode out most days to check on things and help where needed. Amelia, now in her 50s, had become the matriarch not just of her own family but of the extended community, known for her wisdom, her kindness, and her skill as a mediator when disputes arose. The little house that Thomas had built himself had expanded over the years into a sprawling homestead. New rooms had been added as children arrived, and eventually a separate house was built for Matthew and Catherine's growing family. The property hummed with activity and life, with grandchildren running through the fields where their parents had once played. One evening in late spring, When Amelia was 55 and Thomas was 61, they sat in their now customary spot on the porch, watching the sunset. Thomas's hair had gone completely gray, and he moved slower than he once had, his old war injury bothering him more with age. Amelia's face showed the lines of a life well lived, laugh lines around her eyes and smile lines around her mouth. "Do you remember what today is?" Thomas asked. Amelia thought for a moment, then smiled. "It has been 33 years since I arrived in Silver City. 33 years since you stepped off that stagecoach with trembling hands, wearing that blue traveling dress and looking scared to death." "I was terrified," she admitted. "I thought I had made the biggest mistake of my life. And now I know it was the best decision I ever made." "You kept your promise, Thomas. You steadied me always. Through every challenge, every fear, every difficulty. You were my constant." "It was easy to keep that promise," he said, reaching for her hand. Their fingers intertwined with the ease of decades of practice. "You gave me everything worth having. A family, a home, a purpose beyond just survival. You made me understand what it meant to truly love someone." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and stars began to appear. From inside the house, they could hear the sounds of Catherine preparing dinner, and in the distance, the laughter of grandchildren playing. "I wish I could go back and tell that frightened young seamstress in Boston what her life would become," Amelia said softly. "I would tell her that taking that leap of faith would lead to more happiness than she could imagine. I would tell her that the man waiting for her in Silver City would become not just her husband but her best friend, her partner, and the love of her life. And I would tell that lonely rancher advertising for a wife that he was about to meet the woman who would change everything," Thomas added. "That she would take his empty house and turn it into a home, that she would give him children and grandchildren, that she would stand beside him through everything life brought their way." "We have been blessed," Amelia said. "Yes, we have." They remained on the porch until full dark, then went inside to join their family for dinner. The table, which Thomas had built decades ago for just the two of them, was now surrounded by Matthew and Catherine and their 3 children, Sarah and Joseph, who had ridden out from town, and Rebecca and her husband, who had come up from their place. Only Daniel was absent, still away at school. As Amelia looked around at the faces of her family, all of them here because she had been brave enough to answer an advertisement, and Thomas had been kind enough to steady her trembling hands, she felt a sense of peace and fulfillment that went soul deep. After dinner, as had become tradition, the family gathered in the sitting room. Catherine played the piano, a beautiful instrument Thomas had bought several years earlier, and they sang together. The grandchildren performed a little play they had created, making everyone laugh with their antics. Sarah read from a new book she had acquired, and Rebecca shared stories about a particularly challenging horse she had just trained. Later, when everyone had departed to their own homes or the guest rooms, Amelia and Thomas prepared for bed. It was a ritual they had performed thousands of times, but it never became mundane. Thomas helped her with the buttons on her dress that she could not reach, and she helped him with the boots that his stiff knee made difficult to remove. As they lay in bed, the house quiet around them, Thomas pulled Amelia close. "I love you," he said, as he did every night. "I love you too," she replied, as she did every night. They fell asleep in each other's arms, 2 people who had found in each other everything they had ever needed. The scared mail-order bride and the lonely rancher had built a legacy of love that would continue for generations. The final years of their life together were peaceful ones. Thomas passed away at the age of 74, peacefully in his sleep with Amelia beside him. The entire community mourned the loss of a good man, and his funeral brought together people from across the territory, whose lives he had touched. Amelia grieved deeply, but found comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch that continued to thrive, and in the memories of 46 years of happy marriage. She remained in the house Thomas had built, refusing all suggestions that she move to town or live with one of the children. "This is where I belong," she said firmly. "This is where Thomas brought me as his bride, where we raised our family, where we built our life. I will stay here." And she did, living another 8 years after Thomas's death. She spent her days surrounded by family, watching great-grandchildren be born and grow, seeing the ranch continue to prosper under Matthew's management, and taking pride in the successes of all her children. On a summer evening, when Amelia was 77 years old, she sat on the porch watching the sunset. Matthew had offered to sit with her, but she had gently refused, wanting to be alone with her memories. As the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, she thought about that young woman who had stepped off a stagecoach all those years ago, her hands trembling with fear and hope. "I am ready, Thomas," she whispered to the empty air, to the man who still held her heart even though he was gone. "I have lived a good life. We built something beautiful together, and it will continue long after I am gone. Our children are thriving, our grandchildren are growing strong, and the love we shared has multiplied through generations. You kept your promise. You steadied me always. And now I am ready to come find you." That night, Amelia Xavier passed away peacefully in her sleep, in the bed she had shared with Thomas for 46 years, in the house he had built with his own hands, surrounded by the life they had created together. The entire town of Silver City came to her funeral. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to celebrate a life well lived, to honor a woman who had come west as a frightened mail-order bride and became the beloved matriarch of a sprawling family. Matthew stood at her grave, his arm around his own grandson, and told the story he had heard countless times. "My mother stepped off a stagecoach with trembling hands, and my father steadied her. He promised he would always steady her, and he kept that promise every day of his life. They built all of this," he gestured at the family gathered around them, "from courage and love and faith in each other. That is their legacy. That is what they gave us." The ranch continued for generations, passed down through Matthew's line and then to his children. The house Thomas built was preserved and expanded, always kept in the family. The story of Thomas and Amelia became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. A young cowboy and a mail-order bride had taken a chance on each other, had built a love that withstood every challenge, had created a family and a legacy that endured. Their trembling hands had steadied each other through 46 years of marriage, through joy and sorrow, through triumph and challenge, through all the beautiful ordinary moments that make up a life. And in the end, they had proved that sometimes the greatest adventures come from taking a leap of faith, that love can bloom between strangers, and that two people who are brave enough to reach for each other can build something that lasts forever. The land they loved continued to thrive. The family they created continued to grow. And the love story that began with trembling hands and a gentle promise became the foundation for generations of Xavier family members who grew up knowing that real love, true partnership, and genuine devotion were not just romantic ideals but lived realities. Thomas and Amelia Xavier were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could watch over the land and the legacy they had built together. Their headstones bore simple inscriptions with their names, dates, and a quote that summed up their entire relationship. On Thomas's stone, "I will steady you always." On Amelia's stone, "And I will stand beside you forever." Together, even in death, they remained united, two souls who had found in each other everything they had ever needed or wanted. The scared young woman from Boston and the lonely rancher from Missouri had become legendary in their family, an example of what love could be when two people committed fully to each other. Years later, when the great-great-grandchildren would ask about the origins of the ranch and the family, they would be told the story of how it all began. They would hear about the mail-order bride who arrived with trembling hands, and the cowboy who steadied her and promised to always do so. They would learn about the love that grew from those uncertain beginnings, the family that was built on that love, and the legacy that continued because two people had been brave enough to take a chance on each other. And in that way, Thomas and Amelia lived on, not just in the memories of those who knew them, but in the very foundation of the family they created, in the values they instilled, in the love they demonstrated, and in the example they set for what marriage and partnership could truly be. The story that began on a dusty street in Silver City, New Mexico in 1882, became timeless, a reminder that real love requires courage, that true partnership means steadying each other through all of life's challenges, and that the greatest adventures often begin with a single act of faith. Two strangers who became partners, who became lovers, who became the foundation of a family that would span generations, all because Amelia had been brave enough to step off that stagecoach, and Thomas had been kind enough to steady her trembling hands and promise to do so always.